We begin with a dead guy you've never heard of. A dead guy you've never heard of who was also not elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame this afternoon. I mean, we already know the Hall of Fame voters have screwed it up. They're the Hall of Fame voters. There were at least 9 Hall of Famers on the 2015 ballot. Randy Johnson, Pedro Martinez, Smoltz, Biggio, who got in, and Trammell, Messina, Raines, McGriff, Larry Walker, maybe a 10th, Piazza or Sheffield, I'm not sure, who did not. To their credit, the writers have managed to actually elect 4 guys in the same vote for only the 3rd time ever, but roughly 400 of the writers did not vote for, just as an example, Alan Trammell. By every measure in sum, Trammell is either about this much behind Craig Biggio and Derek Jeter or this much ahead of them. And Sheffield got 64 votes, 150 fewer than Curt Schilling, which is, well, evidence of mass insanity caused by poisoned grain or something. As Hall of Fame President Jeff Idelson, a lovely man and a professional friend of mine for 20 years, said over the weekend, the balloting process has truly stood the test of time. That's right, because every effort, nobody's ever been able to break through the bureaucracy to fix the damn thing. It's very hard to have second guesses about who's in here. It sure is. Where do you begin? The 20 guys who are in there who should not be, or the top 20 guys who should be in there instead? And this was a good year. The odds of the Baseball Writers Association just getting close to getting it right 2 years in a row, about akin to the proverbial room full of monkeys with typewriters accidentally writing Hamlet, and then going back and rewriting it to correct Shakespeare's omission about the Danish line of succession. Trammell, Messina, Raines, McGriff, Walker, maybe Sheffield and Piazza got screwed, and so did their fans, but this is not about them. This is about a dead guy who you've never heard of, who was also not elected by the writers this year or by anybody else, and probably never will be, because he is the original victim, Screwy Zero, in the answer to the question, how long have the writers and the special committees been screwing up the Baseball Hall of Fame votes? The answer is, since day one. And the original victim is Herman Long. In one of the very first Hall of Fame votes in 1936, Herman Long finished 8th. He got 15.5 votes. He finished 4 spots behind Cy Young. He finished just behind the Iron Man pitcher Old Hoss Radbourn, who now has a Twitter account. 15.5 votes for Herman Long. The next year, Herman Long got 1 vote. The year after that, 1 vote. 1939, 1 vote. 1945, 1 vote. The year after that, none. The year after that, none. 1950, none. 1960, none. 1970, none. After 1945, he never got another vote. Finished 8th in the balloting among all the players who appeared in the 19th century, when there was nobody in the Hall of Fame. 78 different voters, 60 different players got votes in 1936. Half of them eventually got elected. Every other guy who finished in the top 15 eventually got elected. Herman Long, as of 1936, the 8th best player of the 19th century. As of 1937, you suck. Who was he? He was the shortstop on Boston's 5 pennant winners in the 1890s. And modern analytics are very complimentary to him. An OPS of 800 or better, 4 years in a row, 2 100 RBI seasons, 7 seasons scoring 100 runs. Dead ball era, he hit 91 homers, and twice he had a dozen in 1 year. Still 30th all time with 537 steals. And though in those defense optional days he made more errors than anybody else in history, his defensive WAR is still the 77th best all time among all players. And here's his WAR per year just in Boston, just among his 5 position player teammates who eventually got into Cooperstown. He's 4th out of 6 guys. Everybody but him's in the Hall of Fame. 8th in the balloting in 1936, just ahead of the most famous player of the 19th century, King Kelly, just ahead of the pitcher so fast that they had to move the mound back from 50 feet to 60 feet 6 inches, Amos Russi, just ahead of the third baseman he stood next to in Boston, Jimmy Collins. And then, bye, Felicia. Like he was squirted out of the baseball universe by forces beyond our comprehension. Researcher Gray Womack of the blog Baseball Past and Present picked up on my online grumbling about Herman Long and tried to figure out how this happened. He starts with the assumption that the then Washington Senators owner and 19th century pitching star Clark Griffith was one of the 1936 voters. He wrote, Griffith named Long to his all-time team in 1914. 2 weeks before the Veterans Committee vote was announced in January 1936, Griffith included Long on an all-19th century team. And in 1938, Griffith considered Long for a most graceful all-time baseball team. Hannes Wagner narrowly chose Joe Tinker over Long for his all-time squad in March 1936. In 1939, Long was named an alternate for an all-time team voted on by players from 1870 to 1939. So that explains Long finishing 8th among everybody who played before 1900. Still doesn't explain how he went from that in 1 year to 1 vote, and then in 9 years to completely forgotten. Only one thing could explain that. The Special Veterans Committee from 1936 that voted him the 8th greatest, it was disbanded. And for a decade, everybody was lumped into the annual vote of the Baseball Writers Association of America. And they killed Herman Long. Well, metaphorically. He had succumbed to tuberculosis in 1909, so the vote didn't even symbolically contribute to his actual death. Of course, the tuberculosis also means he didn't tick off a lot of voters somehow in 1937, since he was just as dead that winter as he had been the previous one. So even as our friends the writers managed to put in 4 deserving Hall of Famers while still screwing up the vote again today, as we wring our hands about Trammell and all the rest not getting in, just give a passing thought to poor Herman Long. And remember one last thing that should have made him a lead pipe cinch for Cooperstown. The shortstop of the New York Yankees in their very first game, long before they officially were the Yankees, on April 22nd, 1903, was Herman Long. First, he doesn't get a farewell tour, and now this.